three communities that are predominantly minority. The near west side, which is predominantly Latino, the northeast area, which is the United Nations of Missouri, but it's filled with ethnic, racial groups and immigrants. And then the east side, which has been segregated for years. Remember, it was almost in the 1970s before African Americans could live south of 27th Street. You couldn't live west of Troost and south of 27th Street. In my lifetime, I mean, this is probably stopped in 1968, somewhere around there. So, you know, the city was extremely segregated when the desegregation effort started.
And people in the white community began to move out of the Kansas City School District into what was then called the Suburban School District, Center School District, Hickman Mill School District. Independence School District was, many of the Kansas City schools were in the city of Independence.
Much of that hasn't changed. Parents in the childbearing age are primarily living in the Brookside area, or they live out south, in South Kansas City, inside the corporate city limits. But understand, that means that their children, at least for a while, were going to Center High School, which is another whole school district, separate and distinct from the Kansas City School District. But now that it has become predominantly African American, most of the white parents are sending their children to private schools, and in some cases, church-related private schools. Kansas City has changed dramatically. We're still considered to be one of the most segregated cities in the country. We still have Troost as the MasonDixon Line that runs straight through our community.
Pretty typically in Kansas City, the dividing line is Troost, as far away as Troost east, and then the state line west. However, the way the plan was set up, it was more Main Street to the east and then over to state line, and then as far away north as a parent wanted to come. The interesting part about what other people didn't know, that a large segment of my parents who were minorities did come from across the line over past Troost.
I grew up off of 26th and Line, and I can remember a lot of my friends going to various neighborhood schools, and I was bused to E.F. Sweeney. E.F. Sweeney is located west of the Country Club Plaza. So I remember a lot of long hours on bus rides to and from school.
We were pretty intentional about making sure that we brought in kids from all over, especially minority students, because I felt that it was my responsibility. And I did a lot of reaching out to families at church and everywhere else.
This was a busy, busy, busy time. We worked on planning the schools to fit the themes of the magnet themes. There were meetings with parents, with students, community leaders, all of that. It was just excitement. There were teams of teachers who went out recruiting students.
The year that I was searching for a full kindergarten for my child and living in Lee Summit, there was no such thing. So she's in a daycare and she comes home with a Kansas City, Missouri school district t-shirt on, and I'm wondering, how did she get that? So I found out that they were recruiting in the suburbs all the daycares that they could, and my daughter came home with the information, full kindergarten.
The plan wanted to bring white children back to the city. And in an effort to do that, there were all kinds of issues going on at the time where the outlying districts were chosen to be a part of the suits, but what happened, the judge threw them out. Judge Clark at the time wanted everything to be seamless. However, that was hard to do because part of the plan represented transportation as the biggest issue, just below what the cost of renovating buildings were going to be. But when the transportation effort started, kids came from as far away as way north, 10, 15 miles near Liberty. And I had kids who came from south as far as Grandview. This program was set up to suggest that if kids lived as far away and wanted to attend a school in the city, they were able to do so with no cost to the parents on transporting them. Many children came in cabs because there may not have been any more than one or two kids in that family.
I remember initially there was a voluntary program where the students from Kansas City had an opportunity to go to school districts if the school district decided they were going to participate in the program. But these students were then allowed to transfer to schools outside of the district. I can't recall the name of the school, but I do remember about 5 students that attended a school that was located on the eastern part of Kansas City, on the eastern end of town. And then I also remember how we brought students into the district. At that time, students could come from any school district really in the state of Missouri, not necessarily just in the Kansas City area, but it was any school district. And there were several students I know that transferred in from other school districts. They were transported by cab or even parents were compensated for bringing their children to school, I believe.
Many times these kids stayed on in a cab for an hour and a half to get here and another hour and a half to get home. It was dark.
You know, when you're just bused 2 or 3 hours, away, and I remember spending 2 hours on a bus, and if it was bad weather, I it could be longer. I remember getting home sometimes, and my mother would get off from working at the state building. She would get off work at 5:30 and sometimes beat me home.
So I don't think that worked too well. I think they should have had, say, a guideline to North Kansas City or just north of the river, and we won't extend this any farther than that, transportation.
There was certainly, the real resistance came when busing became an issue. And white parents didn't want to send their kids to the black schools, Lincoln, Emmanuel, Central. And it was okay if the black kids were bused out, but cross-busing was rejected.
We had a population that, not a population, but a range of percentages that we had to keep at that time. It was 60% white and 40% black or other minorities. It wasn't hard for me to do because at that time, the line was truced and over. So I was fortunate to pull in so many kids that were white from Maine and over. And so I never had a problem with the population, with mine becoming stabilized.
Also, I remember with the integration movement that everyone did not look like me. Sometimes I felt that I was welcome, and then sometimes it was a sense of, you can tell from the other students in the building that they were not used to seeing faces of color.
While they were really being bused during the time of desegregation, they did not bus the white children to the black schools. They bused the African-American black children to the white schools. And they were still separate. I don't know how equal it was because they tell stories about being separated during recess time, where many of them would have an opportunity to go outside for recess, but they didn't play together on the playground.
To show that we were being integrated, the white kids that came were put on one particular team. And so when guests came in, it looked like there was real integration going on.
So it was still blacks teaching blacks and being with blacks, and whites teaching whites and being with whites. So I don't know how separate and equal that was, but it did occur.
And so in busing me out to E.F. Sweeney, my mom had to almost trust, different races, different colors. And for her, I would say parents. You may not have felt so much of a racial gap between the staff members, but you can tell at programs and plays that were put on our playground that, when it was a race barrier, they were not used to African Americans being in their neighborhoods and being around their children.
Some of the social outcomes for students of school desegregation would have included an opportunity for them to have a more diverse population in which they were working with, to learn that there were different people and that characteristics are going to be different among different groups just simply because of their culture.
For the first time, white parents were taking minority kids home with them to spend the night.
I would say I benefited from it. I attended a predominantly white institution at UMKC, and even at Lincoln Prep, a multicultural school at the time, I felt it had more diversity than the other high schools within the inner city. It allowed me and provided me with an opportunity to know how to interact with peers of a different race.
And then it went vice versa, attending birthday parties and the families feeling free enough to let their kids, to take them, as well as the other way where we look at a minority kid coming to stay with a white family, attending church together, events that we created at the school site. I remember us having so many parties on that playground that the apartment complex people from both sides would come out and watch because they thought we had a big band and people were picnicking and laughing and talking. And I think we provided the resources to create good social interaction with children.
So I believe it was a learning opportunity not only for them, but for those that they came in contact with. I believe there was an opportunity for them to build relationships with others who were not from that community, and then also to be able to experience something outside of their neighborhoods.
Having the exposure to even some of the cultural kinds of things that students were exposed to, like going to a museum, to a philharmonic or art gallery, some of those things. Those are cultural expectations or exposures that our students had an opportunity to be a part of. And then just working together with students of your own culture, that you learn how to work in a way that is positive.
A lot of my friends went to our neighborhood school. So I believe I missed out on a lot of opportunities to build social relationships with my neighbors. It put a kind of a divided line. Some of my friends I were able to still play with on the street as well, but I believe our neighborhood and our community started to separate. Families did not know each other. It used to be that, if someone down the street said something to you, it was okay because they knew your mother. And that was because we all went to school together. And I do think when those efforts were put into place, it divided up our communities. And I believe our communities even now today are, as I would say, are receiving, I don't want to say pushback, but it's resulting from the deseg movement.
It wasn't until we got over there and realized that it was a different culture, the expectation was different, we weren't treated the same way that we were treated at our home school, and pretty much that many of the friends that we had grew up with from elementary through high school were still back at our home-based schools, and we were being separated.
You know, I'll say the only difference is that we don't maybe call it desegregation no more, or we don't call it segregation. But if you look at the high schools, they're still segregated. It's predominantly African American within the inner city. You look at Northeast High School, you have probably approximately 2,000 students at Northeast High School speaking 40 different languages. That's the north end of Kansas City, and those pockets are, whether it's Somalian or Asian or different ethnicities, it's a melting pot. And you really think about the other communities in Kansas City, they're still segregated.
African American communities success population, which is now living in Raytown, north of the river, Grandview, Independence, Belton, Blue Springs, and then in the last 20 years or so, they're even hopping over across state line.
You look at the predominantly white high schools, they're still predominantly white. You may have pockets in Lee Summit or pockets in Blue Springs where African Americans live there, but typically in those school districts, the African Americans who live there are typically the athletes, where they have been, I don't want to say apartment has been paid for them, but they've been recruited from the inner city to come play sports.
Is so deeply entrenched that I'm not sure that it's going to be done completely in the next 25, 50 years. I cannot envision the complete desegregation of the Kansas, Missouri school district.
I believe that we're still as segregated as we were back then. I think the tool that enables us to move forward at this point is that it's based on income, and that we're segregated in our communities now based on income, not because of schools.
I'm kind of optimistic because I do see the city. I'm cautiously optimistic because I do see some changes going on in the city.
And so I will say within Kansas City, it's a good time for integration. And I know we didn't, some people say we didn't get it right the first time, but history has a funny way of repeating itself. And this time around, I'm hoping we get it right.